Good afternoon and welcome to this third edition of Indian Knowledge Systems course at IIT Gandhinagar, where this year we want to deal with Indian technologies. What were the technologies that were developed in India? In ancient India, so we use the word ancient in a loose way because, as you will see, sometimes we will go right into the pre-colonial and colonial periods. And we have, our objective is mainly to do justice to the topic, not by covering all technologies, that will not be possible in this semester, but at least some of the most important ones. We will be depending on a number of scholars from various IITs and other institutions in India who will visit us for the purpose. Lectures will be on Wednesdays and Thursdays always, but some of the weeks will not have lectures. Otherwise, it would be too many hours. There are many misconceptions in India, in the popular mind, about technologies in ancient India. We hear constantly about aeronautics, about tremendous feat of genetic manipulation or surgery and so on. There were certain astonishing achievements by all means, and we will see a few, but there's also a lot of confusion about what was really done and what was not done. To ascertain whether certain claims are valid or not, or plausible or not, we have to go to genuine sources. So what are those sources? Basically, the sources that will be used, I believe, by all scholars in this course are, number one, archaeology. You dig a site and you find a certain furnace where metal was smelted, and you can conduct scientific analysis, and you can get a lot of data on the nature of that metallurgy and how sophisticated it was or was not. So archaeology will give us a lot of information about objects which were manufactured and how they were manufactured and at what period of time and so on. This is one. The second, after a while, will be literature, the texts. So today we will see, for example, a few texts coming from us from Greece, from Rome, from Arabic writers, and so on. And these are extremely useful testimonies because they will give a whole wealth of additional details which archaeology cannot always supply. So texts, inscriptions certainly will be used, which is the science of epigraphy, as you know, will be used, I'm sure, by a number of scholars. If you take, for example, water management, there are hundreds of inscriptions across India that give information on the type of water structures that were built, whether tanks or dams, and by whom and to benefit whom, and for what purposes of irrigation or others. So this is the third source. And a fourth source, some of which we will see tomorrow in particular, will be testimonies by travelers to India who will be telling us about some of the ancient achievements, what they saw. So I'll give you one example perhaps today of testimonies that can be sometimes regarded as dubious. It doesn't mean because one traveler came 1,500 years ago and tells us, I saw this, it doesn't necessarily have to be trusted. We still have to put some of those testimonies to the test. So therefore, there is a lot of historiography, the method of history that has to be used to build a consistent picture. And I'm sure a lot of scholars will be doing that, but they will also sometimes go into certain technicalities because they are experts in their own field. So we will have a water structure expert who will give us some of the actual mechanics of a particular water structure, many of which were totally misunderstood until these deep studies were conducted. This is the case, for example, of the Grand Anicut in Tamil Nadu, which the British colonial authorities studied a lot and messed up with quite a lot, but never really understood. They didn't understand how it was meant to work. And it's only recently that a proper understanding was arrived at. So therefore, this is a fascinating field of inquiry, and I hope you will find it exciting and rewarding. And at the end of the day, what builds up is not necessarily, an image of an ancient India that knows everything about everything, that can master all kinds of technologies which would be regarded, as well beyond the possibilities of those times, but it is an India that is tremendously active, productive, dynamic, that has entire sections of the society participating in those technologies. And if time permits, in fact, I might add one lecture on the social aspects of technologies, how, for example, it was often the lower classes of the society that created metallurgy, created certain techniques of architecture, and so on. So there is a lot of dynamism in the society that can be felt through all these technologies, and that I think will also come to light during this course. So let me now begin our little journey by looking at very early evidences for Indian technologies, and at that period of time we will be depending almost exclusively, though not quite, as you will see in a minute, on archaeology. And this is a map of a whole region of Middle Asia geographically, which, as you can see, includes parts of India. So this green patch is nothing but the Indus or Harappan civilization. You will see why this word Meluha has been written over it by the archaeologists who drew this map. Then in yellow, you see Magan, which corresponds broadly to Oman today, and it was a contemporary civilization. So we are talking about now somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 BC, the third millennium before our common era. And in pink, you have what is now the Emirates, and that was called Dilmun in those days. And then a little further up, this little patch called Agade actually could have been drawn much larger, and it corresponds to what is known as the Mesopotamian civilization. There are many other civilizations here which have not been mapped, especially in Iran and parts of Arabia. And then you have this big mauve, huge area in Central Asia all the way to the Caspian Sea. This is a fairly recent discovery, about 40-year-old discovery of a civilization which has been called the Oxus civilization, also known as the Bactria-Marjana Archaeological Complex, or BMAC, with which the Harappans were in contact. So all these civilizations were actually interacting and trading, and the reason I'm showing this is because there is some evidence here that the Harappans who were in northwest India, what is today Punjab, Haryana, parts of Uttar Pradesh, parts of Rajasthan, much of Gujarat, and all of Pakistan, and even a few parts of Afghanistan. So this whole region was in contact with Mesopotamia, and the advantage is that in Mesopotamia a lot of literature has been documented and translated. So the script which you see here on the left of this cylindrical seal, which is a tiny little cylinder which can be rolled out on clay, and this is the result which you see. This is the rollout of this cylindrical seal. Therefore, the extreme left and the extreme right of this tablet, Mesopotamian tablet, coincide. They are the same. And what you see is a kind of a ruler seated on a throne, and there are visitors. two visitors, and then there's someone sitting on the lap of the ruler who apparently is an interpreter. He, and the cuneiform script, which you see on the left, on this vertical strip on the left of the seal, that cuneiform strip reads, Su Ilishu Meluha Interpreter. What is this Meluha? Well, there are many other tablets, about 70 of them, Mesopotamian clay tablets that contain this word. And by collating all the evidence and all the context, the consensus among archaeologists is that Meluha corresponds to the Indus civilization, which is why that word was there in the map. So it doesn't stop there. We have, there is a mighty ruler, the first Akkadian ruler known as Sargon in the 23rd century BCE. BCE, for those who might not be familiar with this abbreviation, means before Common Era. And Sargon boasted, literally boasted in an inscription that ships from Meluha, from Magan, from Dilmun, these are the two other regions we saw in the Persian Gulf a little earlier on the map, Sargon, is able to bring them all the way to the quay of Akkad. Akkad was a port city in Mesopotamia, upstream of one of the two major rivers there, Tigris or Euphrates. So he's boasting literally that he is so mighty that he can get ships from this distant region, Meluha, coming all the way. And what do these ships contain? This is culled from a number of these tablets. They bring to Akkad or to the Mesopotamian civilization semi-precious beads, and you see some of them on the right. These are the typical carnelian Harappan beads, and they are long beads which are drilled. They have a hole running through which permits people to string them into long necklaces. These beads are very beautiful, highly polished, and the drilling of those long beads was a Harappan trade secret. Nobody else in the ancient world was able to drill long beads like this. It's extremely delicate. It requires a mastery of the making of drill bits and drilling techniques. And even if I asked our mechanical engineering students here with modern electrical drills to drill such a bead, most of the time you would be breaking it probably initially. So it's a very difficult job, and to drill along, and the maximum length was 5 inches. And these which you see here were actually excavated from a Mesopotamian grave. And so this is a technology. Bead making is a technology which is perhaps one of the most ancient in the world, because there are rough stone beads found in many Paleolithic societies, so prior to 10,000 BC. And so this is one of the most ancient technologies of humanity. Humans have always loved having, something hanging on their chest or at their wrist, sometimes at the ankle, and all kinds of materials have been used for bead making. So we had, for example, 2 years ago at IIT Gandhinagar, a major conference on stone beads, where experts came from all over the world. At the end of this month, January, you will see announcements of a conference on glass, and many of the artifacts will be glass beads, very different technology altogether. So the Harappan beads were famous in this entire region. Lapis Lazuli, now this is extremely interesting, because Lapis Lazuli, imported from Meluha, does not originate in Meluha. There is no Lapis Lazuli in northwest of the Indian subcontinent. Where does it come from? Central Asia, Tajikistan, what is today Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, that whole region. The Harappans understood that the Mesopotamians were very fond of Lapis Lazuli. They themselves did not particularly like it. A few Harappan objects of, artifacts, ornaments of lapis lazuli were found, but very few. However, they went to Central Asia, got the raw material, brought it into the workshops of Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, and other Harappan cities, fashioned it into ornaments, which then they shipped all the way to Mesopotamia. You can see the complexity of the trade networks. So this is just a small example of it. Pearls. Pearls, of course, would be available only from the seashore, and this is something that the Harappans were able to understand early on, this pearl technology. Timber. Now, Indian timber has been famous almost throughout history. In fact, let me mention right now that much of the Roman navy, the famous navy of the Roman Empire, which gave them mastery over the seas and a certain ease in conquering distant regions from their world, the whole Mediterranean world in particular, was actually teak wood from India. When I say India, of course, in antiquity, by India, we simply mean the Indian subcontinent. There is no division of the subcontinent. So it's to be taken as a geographical term. So this Indian timber was exported right in the 3rd millennium BC from the northwest all the way to Mesopotamia. Ivory, and I'll show you a little example of it, and animals. Monkeys are mentioned, peacocks are mentioned, dogs are mentioned, also dogs and cats, in fact, are mentioned in Mesopotamian tablets. So therefore, there is a vibrant trade, and this trade tells us something about the technologies that were evolved at home. Another technology which I will talk about in a later lecture when we discuss metrology or ancient systems of units in India is the Harappan weight system. And the Harappan weight system is very interesting because, first of all, it's not fully understood yet. Number two, there's plenty of evidence that it has survived all the way to the 20th century in pre-independent India. The weight system used in markets, village markets, town markets, before the metric system was made, more or less universal, was a system of weights very close to the Harappan system of weights. This is well documented, and I'll show you that later. So this is another technology. And what's very interesting here is that the weights found in Dilmun, in the Persian Gulf, which were excavated, were actually absolutely in conformity with the scale of Harappan weights found back here in northwest India. So they became, in fact, in the Mesopotamian tablets, known as the standard of Dilmun. This is a picture of, on the right, you can see a typical Harappan kumb made of ivory. And we do know that Harappans were very familiar with elephants. They might have domesticated some elephants, though this is not absolutely certain. But there's some speculation about that. This design of Harappan kumb is found in many Harappan sites in the Indus civilization. And on the left, you have a pottery sherd, a fragment of typical Harappan pottery with typical design of floral design, which is found very commonly on painted Harappan pottery. But this does not originate from India, it is from Oman. In fact, it is now understood that Harappans not only were exporting their goods and their technologies there, but they had also created settlements along the coast in the Persian Gulf, and at least 2 or 3 of them have been identified. Yes?
Since we are talking about ancient India,
yeah.
I should have asked this question earlier, but can we talk about the boundaries, like ancient boundaries? How do we
So as I said initially, I'm using the word ancient in a very loose way. Ancient normally refers to proto-historical and early historical, all the way to classical. So classical India is normally, but this is just a matter of convention, taken to equate, let us say, the Gupta age. 4th, 5th, 6th centuries, AD or CD. But we will use ancient in a more elastic way because actually often we'll be straying into the medieval period and even a little later into the early colonial age, which will be what we'll see tomorrow with the European travelers. So therefore, do not take ancient as a rigorous definition in our course. Even historians use it sometimes quite elastically also. It's not a very strict term.
Actually, I had a problem with question was about the boundaries. How do we know that area is in Indian territory or So I had,
you mean geographically?
Yeah. So I had seen one article that a battery was found in Iraq 22,000 years ago.
22,000 years ago?
Yeah.
What was found in Iraq?
A battery.
That sounds,
in Iraq,
22,000 years, I think you have 2 zeros in excess, probably.
Oh, sorry, 2200.
Okay, even 2200 must have 1 zero in excess because...
that's for sure.
No.
2200.
A battery, you mean an electrical device? I will request you to give me the best possible evidence for this. I'll go through it, but I'm not aware of any development of electricity in the what is known as the proto-historical period anywhere in the world. That comes much later, even in the 2nd millennium CE, as far as is known.
It was sort of a vessel. It was sort of a vessel, a sand vessel, and it had 2 electrodes and electrolytes.
So I cannot say anything more about it. So I'll request you to send me the reference.
I just wanted to ask, that region comes into Indian territory of that era or not?
First, let me just see how genuine or not it might be, because again, there are so many. See, where did you see that? On the internet, perhaps? Yeah. Yes, that's the problem, you see. The internet is the problem. There are so many websites giving you all kinds of information, and unless you go to the source, unless you find a real genuine scholar who has documented very scientifically, unless the object has been dated rigorously, because dating is not always easy, sometimes it's not even possible. So it requires a lot of work to be really sure. So internet is not generally a good source unless you take pains to cross-check everything, So otherwise, don't depend on the internet blindly. You cannot. All right?
But you were asking whether or not that would fall under India.
Yeah.
That was the question.
Under India, well, as I said, I use India as equivalent geographically to what is known as the Indian subcontinent. It's a geological entity which is bounded by the Himalayas conveniently, and the Hindu Kush on the western side. But sometimes India has extended into Afghanistan a little beyond the Hindu Kush. For example, in the Mauryan Empire, Afghanistan was technically part of the Mauryan Empire for a brief while. So therefore, we will just use that definition, as a convenient geographical entity. So if you say Iraq, it would not be part of India, no. Right. Yes? 2 questions, please.
With regards to your last slide,
Huh. Shall I?
so the Lapis Lazuli.
Yes.
Exactly what is it? Is it
Oh, Lapis Lazuli, I'm sorry, I should have made this clear, is a semi-precious stone. It's a stone, it's a mineral, which is found in various parts of the world. In Africa, there is some. In Central Asia, there is a lot. And it has a very deep blue, beautiful blue, which has a little bit of red in it, very little. And it has almost a kind of electric, reflection. And so it makes very beautiful ornaments. It is semi-precious. It's not fully precious like diamond or sapphire or. So this is one of the semi-precious materials that were worked by the Harappans and other cultures elsewhere. Carnelian, this one here, which you see on the bottom right, is another. Carnelian, by the way, is a form of agate, and agate is again a semi-precious stone. And if you want to know, agate is actually much more pale than what you see, but the Harappans were heating that stone artificially to make it more reddish, to give it a deeper hue. So that's, anyway, these are just semi-precious minerals.
Second question is
Yes?
that they were imported from Meluha, but they were not from Meluha. So exactly where were they dated back from?
So the date of Sargon is very well known because the Mesopotamian dynasties have been fully worked out, right? So there's no ambiguity about the date of Sargon, and it therefore gives us a very good confirmation of the age of the Indus civilization, which is in the 3rd millennium BC, and which now we know quite independently through hundreds of radiocarbon dates. You know, you've heard of radiocarbon dating probably. So radiocarbon dating of many Harappan sites has given dates which are also between roughly 2600 BC and 1900 BC for the Indus civilization.
From there they were imported to Meluha.
So as I said, for many of these material actually originated in Meluha. Lapis Lazuli is the only exception in this list. The others are from northwest India. Semi-precious beads, pearls, timber, ivory, these animals like monkeys and peacocks, all of these are from northwest India, right? It's only Lapis Lazuli which I mentioned as an exception. It doesn't originate in northwest India. Okay? Clear? Shall I continue? So, this is a map drawn by our Dr. V.N. Prabhakar, who has been associated with the archaeological sciences here, which shows some of the Harappan materials. So on the right, top right, you have seals, the famous Indus seals or Harappan seals, and on the left you have a number of artifacts, mostly ornaments. You can see again the long Harappan beads, carnelian beads organized in a necklace, and various kinds of seals. So, and some pottery. So this is mapped in this entire region, which today again includes Oman, the Emirates, Iraq, and also a little bit of Iran. In fact, right now there are excavations going on in Iran which are coming up with Harappan artifacts. So the reason I showed this is simply to give us already some clue, some taste of the early technologies which were developed in the Indus civilization. And here, interestingly, you have even a seal, whereas the original Harappan seals back here, or Indus seals, are always square or rectangular. In the Persian Gulf, a few such seals have come out to be circular, which is an adaptation to local tastes and conventions. And interestingly also, the signs are the same as those used here back in India. These are the same Harappan or Indus signs, which are still not deciphered. However, the sequence of signs found in the Persian Gulf is not found back in India. So it is used to encode a different language altogether. Now, let us come to what is known as the early, we leave proto-history, which is the period of the Harappan civilization, and we come to the early historical period. And here we have a lot of interesting testimonies about trade with India, and therefore more lists of goods are coming up, and therefore more technologies can be understood. So in the Bible itself, the Old Testament, the first part of the Bible, you might have heard of a famous king called King Solomon. These data are a little bit speculative, but usually scholars put him in the 10th century BCE, before Common Era, and it's almost a kind of echo of Sargon, because he receives from the port of Ophir, so this name appears in the Bible, a cargo of gold, silver, sandalwood, pearls, ivory, apes, and peacocks. So it's almost, except for gold and silver and sandalwood, otherwise all the other items were already listed by Sargon. So sandalwood, of course, is a good indication, and peacocks, good indication that we are dealing with India. And this is the text, actually, which I will not read out, except towards the end you can see plenty of sandalwood and precious stones, and all of this brought from this port of Ophir. Now the question was, where is Ophir? And there have been many theories, and sometimes it has been located in Kerala, sometimes in Gujarat. To me, the more likely location is what is today a small village called Sofia near Mumbai. And this seems to be the likely candidate for this ancient port, which has now disappeared. What's interesting also is that the Old Testament has a number of words which are close to Tamil, which seems to indicate trade with South India. And as we will see shortly, trade with South India was a major activity in the Mediterranean world. So, for example, Tuki in Hebrew for parrot is close to Toke in Tamil for peacock. But there are a few more such words. Now, let us move to very firm ground. Here we will not have too much of speculation. And we come to the time of the contacts with the Greeks. You've heard of Alexander the Great. You've heard of his invasion of India. This is a map of his empire. And you can see on the extreme right that his empire extends all the way to the Indus Valley. So, in fact, almost the entire western bank of the Indus River was conquered by Alexander the Great. And then all the way, of course, to Greece, all the way to Egypt. So without going too much into history, in fact, he himself recorded his own history, first of all, through a number of chroniclers, and we'll see one or two of them, but also through coins. And coins is another source sometimes of information on these cultural contacts. You see here Alexander on the top left, Alexander himself portrayed in a coin and wearing the scalp of an elephant. Now, what does this elephant represent? It is simply India. The elephant is India because that was the most awesome sight that was awaiting them, awaiting Alexander's army when they came to India. And the army of Porus, the Indian king of the region corresponding to Sindh today, was largely composed of elephants. And that was extremely impressive for the Greek soldiers, but they were on horseback, which had the advantage of greater mobility. So these are some of the coins. On the right is the goddess of victory, Nike, rewarding Alexander after his defeat of Porus. So you see Alexander on his horse and Porus on his elephant. Now, the impression that you get when you read the testimonies of the chroniclers of Alexander who recorded all this campaign, because don't forget, we have no Indian sources on the campaign of Alexander the Great. If we didn't have the Greek writers and the later Roman writers, we would know absolutely nothing from India on the conquest of Alexander, except through a little bit of archaeology here and there. But the general impression that you get is that the subcontinent, India, or the India that they knew, which was largely limited to North India initially, was a very rich and prosperous region with fabulous riches sometimes. So in fact, when Alexander defeats Porus, towards the northern side of the Indus Valley, before they move further, and he's trying actually to convince them to go deeper into India, which at some point they will refuse to do. And Alexander will have to go back because his soldiers will threaten to rebel. But then this is what he tells them. He says, and this is recorded by Quintus Curtius Rufus, later Roman historian, the much rumored riches of the East, this is Alexander speaking, abounded in those very regions to which their steps were now bent. The spoils, that is the loot, the plunder, accordingly which they had taken from the Persians, had now become cheap and common, because Alexander had first of all conquered the whole Persian Empire before coming to India. They were going to fill with pearls, again, pearls, precious stones, gold and ivory. You see, these are again the same kind of goods that we see coming back. Not only their private abodes, he's talking to his soldiers, but all Macedonia and Greece. Macedonia was a region of what is today Greece, where Alexander himself originated. The soldiers who coveted money as well as glory and who had never known his promises to fail, on hearing all this, readily placed their services at his command. So Alexander is promising his soldiers the riches of India to be at their disposal, and this is how he hopes to convince them to continue their campaign. So there are other references, many references in Greek and Roman chronicles to silk, but this silk was probably mostly silk that was coming to India from China, though whether India was also producing silk is a moot point. There is no final answer for that period. Pearls, exploitation of mines is frequently mentioned. So there's a lot of metallurgy going on, and we will have at least 2 or 3 talks later in this course on Indian metallurgy, which is very important, which was actually one of the many, the most important pillars of Indian civilization from a technological point of view. And the fertility of the land. The Indo-Gangetic plain, where basically Alexander was and his army was coming into the Indus plains, is a very, very rich alluvial plain. Those Himalayan rivers deposit a huge amount of sediments, and that makes those plains very rich, and agriculture was always, though less so today, but always a fairly easy practice, and it was easy to get a lot of agricultural produce, relatively easy, especially if the monsoon was reliable. So fertility of the land is another remark. Now, after the victory, after finally all the local Indian kings, rulers of the Indus Valley have been conquered, there is another testimony, which is that the Indian ambassadors were dismissed to their several homes after they have a first encounter with Alexander and after he has conquered them. But in a few days, they returned with presents for Alexander, which consisted of 300 horsemen, 1,030 chariots, each drawn by 4 horses, 1,000 Indian bucklers, a great quantity of linen cloth, 100 talents of steel, some tame lions and tigers of extraordinary size, the skins also of very large lizards, and a quantity of tortoise shells. So that's a very interesting, totally eclectic kind of list. And I'll just offer a few comments, especially on the linen cloth. So this linen cloth made from several vegetal fibers like hemp and a few more. India was reputed for this cloth. Later on, it will be cotton. In fact, in the Harappan times, it was already cotton, and cotton will come back later and will become very popular again as an Indian product. So this is another technology. I mentioned metallurgy a few minutes ago. Textile technology, about which I hope we will have a good scholar coming and visiting us. was another pillar of Indian economy. And there was a huge amount of export of textiles throughout Indian history. We'll see even right now, in a few minutes, some examples. And what is this?
So what is the video last 3 words? So the last 3 words, which is correctly.
Oh, that is the Roman historian. This is the name of the Roman historian who wrote a little later, but borrowing text from the Greeks, and who created a history of Alexander. So his name was Quintus Curtius Rufus. Previous slide?
Yes, sir. So you mentioned Macedonia was ancient Greece. So then why Macedonia and Greece as well?
You know, don't think that today's borders existed in the ancient world. None of our modern borders, almost none, existed in the ancient world. So countries were defined very differently, right? And there was a region which they called Greece, and there was a region which they called Macedonia, which is now part of Greece. And Alexander was from Macedonia, and in fact conquered Greece at the start of his military campaign, right?
When we write the names of the current countries,
Yes.
so do we also make references to it? For example, Greece is written
So that's not the same. These are not the same borders, you see. The boundaries are different today, completely different. So, and if you look at, there are historical atlases, if you want one day to have a look, I'm sure in the library we have. If you just look and flip through the pages, it's very interesting because you can see for a particular region, maybe there are animations on the net today, I don't know, how borders have moved and shifted through time. And they've moved quite a lot for some regions. Of course, not for island nations. If you take Sri Lanka, which was not called like that in ancient times, of course it was the same. But otherwise, remember the Mauryan Empire extended all the way to Afghanistan. So today it's not part of India anymore. Right. So this is well known, and you can flip through any historical atlas and you will see this. Now I wanted to make a few comments on these 100 talents of steel. I do not expect you normally to know what a talent is. It's a unit of weight in the Greek systems of units. So every civilization had its different systems of unit, of weight, of linear measures, of time, of volume, of surface, and we'll see some of them in the case of India later in this course. Now, a talent was a unit which, when multiplied by 100, produced about 2.5 tons. So this 100 talents is about 2.5 tons. Therefore, a talent would be about 25 kilograms, roughly, because there's always some uncertainty about those ancient units. So this is very interesting because what is this steel? So some of you who might have followed some of my earlier courses would know that we are now talking about, anybody remembers? What is that steel? Yes, it is the famous Wootz steel, which was an exclusively Indian production of a very particular kind of steel. I will only say for today because we will have a very eminent archaeometallurgist who will tell us a lot more about Wootz steel and other Indian irons and steels and metals. Wootz steel is a steel that could be fashioned into very thin blades. It had special properties which would allow it not to be brittle, because if you take ordinary steel and you fashion it into very thin sheets, it will not be durable. It will snap very soon. It will break apart. So wood steel did not, and therefore it was very convenient to make weapons, to fashion swords. And it was, Indian steel was highly prized in the Mediterranean world, and they used to take these ingots, those lumps of Indian steel, export them to Damascus, and especially Damascus, where they would be fashioned into swords there. And therefore, it was also known as Damascus steel or Damascus swords. And you will see later in the course more about wood steel. So it's very interesting that here, Alexander is expecting those defeated kings to give him, okay, there is probably there will be some gold and jewels and so on, but it's not what interests him really. It is the Indian steel which is more precious for him, because that he cannot get elsewhere. That's very interesting. Okay, lions and tigers of extraordinary size. It's entirely possible that they had tame lions and tigers. The size would be perhaps an exaggeration. The skins of very large lizards, quite possible. We know about the monitor lizard, right? Which, if that is the case, would be very impressive for people coming from the Mediterranean. And a quantity of tortoise shells which were used for medicinal purposes mostly. We do know that a lot of medicinal plants were exported from India to the Mediterranean world, also to Southeast Asia, all the way to Japan, in fact. Indian medicinal plants have been found even in Japan. So these kind of texts are very rich in information. And this is a modern drawing depicting, I mean, this is just the artist's imagination, depicting Porus handing over a lump of wood steel to Porus to be fashioned in Damascus. We'll see more about the wood steel later, but these are some examples of weapons made out of wood steel, so not ordinary steel at all. It will not do. It would have to be much thicker and therefore much heavier. So the beauty is that those weapons could still be extremely hard, sharp, and yet lightweight, which in battle will make a lot of difference. Now, there are certain oddities in those Greek and Roman texts, and one which has been often discussed and often dismissed as mere fancy is the oddity of gold-digging ants. So Arrian, one Greek historian, scholar, quotes Megasthenes. Megasthenes came to India and was an ambassador to the Mauryan court in Pataliputra or Patna. Today it is Patna in Bihar. And Megasthenes wrote a book called Indica, which unfortunately did not survive, but it was quoted by many other scholars, so we have a fair idea of what that book contained. And in it, he talked about the fact that Indians were able to rear huge ants about this size, which would dig into mountainsides and take out gold from the mountainside. So of course, scholars for a long time dismissed this as mere fancy, and maybe it is fancy. You can read this extract for yourselves a little later, but you can see that these giant ants are burrowing holes in the earth, but they are so much bigger, larger than foxes, in fact, that they make much bigger holes. Interestingly, one French ethnologist by name Michel Pessel, in the 1970s and early 80s, visited the Gilgit-Baltistan region, which is, bordering northern Kashmir and Central Asia. And he found that, in fact, they had a tradition of collecting gold dust from the Himalayan marmot. The marmot is a small mammal, a small animal that does dig out burrows in the mountainside, but of course the soil will have to be soft. The marmot cannot possibly dig into hard rock, no. But it will dig, and out of these burrows, they have a tradition of collecting gold dust. So is that the origin of the Greek legend? This is something that will perhaps always remain in question. But it's interesting how sometimes what we may think to be completely fanciful may have some reality, perhaps through a dose of exaggeration. Now, in the Greek world, from the Greek world, a very important document comes to us, which is known as the Periplus, in short. The full name is Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. The Erythraean Sea is an ancient name for what today we call the Arabian Sea. So between India and Eastern Africa. And this is actually a sailor's manual. It is a text to guide those who are going to sail in all this region, the sailors, and what kind of ports they can expect along this whole coastline. I have borrowed this map, but it gives us a good idea of all the ports that are spoken of in this text. The text dates to the 1st century AD or CE, and it's written in Greek, but not in very chaste Greek. It's written in colloquial Greek because it's meant to be understood by sailors. It's not for literary people. So it has a description of all these ports, when they can be accessed, because in some seasons some of the ports are not easily accessible. How the winds work, how the currents work, etc. Very intricate, meticulous description, which really would have been of great use to the sailors of those times. But it also tells us about the goods that are traded in each particular port. So it's an extremely rich source of information. The whole text is available in English on the net for those who want, on trade in the 1st century AD in this entire region. And it has a lot to say about Indian ports and all these goods, Indian goods that are mostly exported. So I'll just give as an example this port of Barbaricum, which has been identified with the location of Karachi today. So technically part of India in the geographical sense which I defined. And here it gives us a list of the articles which various sailors are bringing from outside into this emporium. An emporium is a trading, a point of trade, a trading port, basically. So clothing, plain and in considerable quantity, mixed also, flowered cottons, yellow stone, topazes, coral, storax, which is, I believe, a kind of resin, frankincense, glass vessels, silver plate, species, I'm not very sure what it refers to, and a little wine. So these are all things which are bought locally in this port. However, there are also exports. So all these traders, of course, will be bringing certain goods which are in demand in the region, and they will be taking products from this region to other parts of the ancient world. So what is exported is very interesting. There is a spice, which is referred to as costus. There is a gum or resin, referred to as bdellium, a yellow dye, and Indians were very good at dyeing technology. So when we say textile technology, it's about spinning the yarn, creating the yarn. It's about weaving the yarn, and it's about dyeing the yarn in many different ways. So all these are technologies which India developed to a great extent. A yellow dye, a spikenard, which is today called muskroot. It's an aromatic plant. Emeralds or green stones, sapphires, furs from China. So you see, because goods are bought in a place near Karachi doesn't mean that they are produced locally. They may have come from far away. Cottons, and these cottons would be an Indian production. Silk thread, again probably from China, and indigo. Indigo is an Indian dye which was produced in various parts of North India. Ships destined for this port put out to sea when the Indian monsoon prevails. So that's a little bit of shipping technology. That is to say, after the month of July. This is when, of course, the southwest monsoon picks up. The voyage of this monsoon is attended with danger, but being shorter is more expeditious. You see, before the monsoon were discovered, as I said, we will not have time to deal extensively with shipping technology. But just a little bit is interesting. It's not just about constructing ships, but it's also about understanding how you can sail through a sea as vast as the Arabian Sea. Initially, this was not done. And the sailors were simply following the coast. Before the discovery of the monsoon wind, in the first, for example, a few centuries BC, sailors were not adventurous enough to cross the Arabian Sea. They just followed the coast from port to port. This has certain advantages. You will be covering the ports, and maybe your trade will be richer in a way, but there are also disadvantages. And the main disadvantage, anyone can guess what it is? There's a big disadvantage in this coastal kind of, sorry?
Being robbed.
Yes, yes, so what is it called in good English? Piracy, exactly. Encountering pirates, because they also can easily stay close to the coast. And therefore, the piracy was a major problem in ancient sailing, just as it remains in parts of the world today. So therefore, they were keen to find ways, and the Greeks and the Romans learned the monsoon winds from Egyptian sailors. You know that Egypt was a Greek and Roman, later Roman colony, and the Egyptians were great sailors. There is some hint that they might have learned themselves from Indian sailors whom they met on the eastern coast of Africa. But anyway, we know for sure that it came to them from Egypt. And this allowed them to try this more dangerous journey. You see the word danger, crossing the sea without any possibility of going back to the shore if anything wrong happens, if you're caught in a storm, etc. So more dangerous, but faster, because you're not hugging the shore and stopping at every port. So you can go straight to your destination, let us say from the Red Sea all the way to the Indian coast, as I will show you soon in a little map. So when Greece kind of faded away, it was absorbed into the Roman Empire, as you know, and then the major trade partners were the Romans. And this also tells us, again, a lot on Indian technologies, the production of spices, and Indian spices were another mainstay of ancient Indian economy. So if you remember metallurgy, the second was textile, exactly, and the third is spices. These three together made India in the ancient world a very wealthy trade partner, and always Indian trade partners were always in deficit. I mean, the trade was always to the advantage of India. India imported much less than it exported. So many kinds of spices, but pepper for the Romans was particularly important because pepper had several medicinal properties. You know very well that if you have a cough or a cold, your grandmother may ask you to put some pepper in milk or in something else. It does help a lot. But they also used it for mummification. Romans practiced mummification, which they partly learned from the Egyptians, and it has certain preservation properties. Perfumes, so Indian cosmetics, as I said, we will not have this in the course, but Indians were very good all the way to the medieval era. You might have heard about the Mughals' love for perfumes. So perfumery, cosmetic production was another big technology, in fact. Timber, once again, especially teak wood. The reason why teak wood particularly was so prized is because it stays well in saline water, in the sea. Other woods will not be preserved so well. Semi-precious stones, lots of them, medicinal plants, silk and textiles, ivory, peacocks, and so on. So you're beginning to now see this kind of list coming back again and again. Initially, the Roman trade was happening not through the sea but overland. That is to say, what is known as the Silk Route. And I'll show you a map in a minute. This was a very long route, long road, about 7,000 kilometers, not a joke, coming from the Mediterranean world all the way to China. India was connected to it through Kashmir, through Gilgit, in fact. There was a drawback, and the drawback here was not piracy, but another kind of official piracy, if you like, legitimate legal piracy, which is taxation. When the traders passed through a kingdom, they would have to pay tax. Because that is, the rulers considered that in exchange for this tax, they were providing security in the cities. The traders were protected, their goods were protected, so they had to pay tax. But then the taxes kept rising, and one day they found that it was much better to sail across the sea, because then they didn't have to pay taxes to anyone. So that was a bit later. So these are some details which I may skip for today, where we have a number of possible candidates for major points of trade with the Romans, initially all on the western coast. The points of trade on the eastern coast came later. In fact, when it was the ports of Tamil Nadu, they were initially accessed overland by traveling across the Palakkad Pass, between Kerala and Tamil Nadu, and bringing their goods to the eastern coast through that pass, overland. Later on, they accessed the eastern ports directly through the sea also. South India was a major exporter of semi-precious stones, sometimes precious ones also. And it was known as the treasure chest of the ancient world. So this is something that has continued till very recent times. All kinds of semi-precious stones were fashioned into ornaments in various parts of the world. So this is a map showing how the traders would go back to the Mediterranean from the western coast of India, whether it is Gujarat, Maharashtra, Karnataka, Kerala. There were ports with which the Romans were trading throughout, and taking those Indian goods into the Red Sea. But then, don't forget, the Suez Canal did not exist. Therefore, they could not cross with the same ships into the Mediterranean. They had to stop at certain ponds there, and Berenike is one of them, which is still being excavated today. And then they would have to transship the goods overland all the way to another port, which was usually Alexandria. These are some images of excavations at Berenike, where Indian cotton textiles, and you see a relic of it on the right side with the printed pattern, were excavated. And this is a beauty of the climate there, very dry, that even textile was preserved. In India, it's extremely rare to have, unfortunately, any such preservation of very ancient textile material. This is another example from a little later, the 5th century CE, and this is from in Middle Egypt, a city called Fustat, where tombs were found to contain Indian textile. If textile is going to be buried in a tomb, it means it's regarded as very valuable. Otherwise, it would not be kept, obviously. So this tells you something about how Indian textile was appreciated, valued. So this is a view of the Silk Roads or Silk Route. We sometimes imagine that it is a single road from the Mediterranean into China. It was not one, it was many, and it also fluctuated in time. But these are some of the main ones. In red, overland Silk Roads. In blue, the later maritime Silk Roads, which were involved more or less in the same kind of trade. So from China, yes?
How do we know this textile was from Gujarat?
How do we know that?
Those textile materials
We're from India. Because for a time, India was the only producer of cotton. In fact, cotton production in India begins with the Harappan civilization. They were the ones who understood that this plant, so there are two types of cotton, the low plant and the tree, the cotton tree. The Harappans were using the low bush, and this continued into historical period, and we have the texts. We have the text telling us that this cotton is made in India and comes from India. So the archaeological evidence and the textual evidence are perfectly in agreement in this case.
So because Egyptians themselves are good cotton.
Yes, but probably their production was not of the same kind, and I don't know. We would have to investigate exactly why, but it's a fact that Indian cotton was traveling all the way to the Mediterranean. You see Berenike and Fustat, and there is some evidence in the Roman world of textile from India. Later on, it will continue in medieval Europe, for example, the pre-colonial time. You will see a lot of Indian textile, cotton textile mostly, and jute and linen traveling to Europe. So it's a continuous story. This is kind of never stopped. Yes?
So you mentioned that there is no Indian account of the Greek invasion.
Of Alexander?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's the reason for that? Because you also mentioned in Harappan there was a tablet. So Indian
First of all, don't mix up the periods. Harappans, we're talking about the 3rd millennium BCE, before Common Era. Alexander is in the 4th century BCE, so it's about 325 or 26 BCE. So there are 2,000 years between the Harappans and Alexander, first of all. Secondly, Indians did not usually look at history in the manner that Europeans looked at it. So there were perhaps some chronicles, and later on there will be historical chronicles in India. Very much so. The famous first known Indian historical chronicle comes to us from Kashmir, Raja Tarangini. That is in the 11th century CE, much later. But the point is, there are no records from Indian texts. For example, Ashoka, who follows Alexander by just, not even a century, Ashoka has recorded edicts. He has inscriptions on a lot of pillars and rocks and so on. And but he doesn't give us, any such historical landmark, because his whole intention is different. It's not about history. It's about conveying messages about his rule and so on. So we don't have. We have a lot of Buddhist literature before Alexander's invasion and after, Jain literature, late Vedic literature. None of it, for what is known, mentions Alexander's invasion. So this is one difficulty that often the sources are missing in India. But then again, a lot of texts have disappeared. We should not judge, the entire Indian evidence from what survives. It could be that there was a text somewhere. It could even be sometimes that a text will be discovered eventually that may fill a gap, a piece of the jigsaw puzzle. So we can't say. But as of now, there is no source, Indian source on Alexander's invasion. So when we come to China now, India and China have been interacting for at least 2,000 years. Perhaps more in respect of some minor trade, minor exchanges. And, but then at a certain point, especially when China adopts Buddhism, which begins, it's a story that begins to happen a couple of centuries AD or CE, then the contacts become much more sustained. And then the cultural exchanges happen at all levels, not just at the religious or philosophical level of Buddhism migrating to China. So what we know, and we will not deal with mathematics or astronomy in this course, but nevertheless I thought it would be worth mentioning that there is evidence of Chinese mathematicians being aware in the 7th or 8th century CE, aware of Indian works of mathematics and astronomy. In fact, there's evidence of a whole Indian family being settled in China, 3 families, in fact, of Indian astronomers, and holding important positions in the Tang dynasty. So they write about Indian mathematics, Indian decimal system, trigonometry, and very interestingly, there are also texts of alchemy, Chinese texts of alchemy. What is alchemy? It is, the ancestors of chemistry. It's a set of chemical practices. Alchemists do have chemical operations in their labs, but of course they do not know modern chemistry in the way it is known. They have another completely different theory about the chemical properties of elements like mercury, like sulfur, and other elements. And these have a kind of occult, semi-occult, semi-spiritual foundation. So alchemy has arose in China, in India, in the Arabic world, and later on in Europe itself. And it was always looking for, the elixir of immortality. It was also looking for a way to transmute base metals like lead or iron into gold. So there are a lot of Indian texts of alchemy, and after all, whatever belief you may have in the alchemical practices, they did eventually lay some foundations for chemistry in the course of time, especially in Europe. So we have Chinese texts referring to Indian alchemy and vice versa. And so there are testimonies. I will not read out this whole passage, but a lot of evidence of Chinese translations of Indian texts, especially in mathematics and astronomy, but also, interestingly, in medicine. And a lot of Chinese medical works refer to Buddhist medicine, and Buddhist medicine was very largely Ayurveda. Buddhism is closely intertwined with Ayurveda. Not only medicine in particular, but I forgot to mention that ophthalmology in particular, I think this passage was skipped here. Ophthalmology, there is a Chinese text of ophthalmology which is completely based on Ayurvedic ophthalmology. Ophthalmology is actually one of the branches of Ayurveda, the cure of eye diseases, eye problems. And some of you might know that Sushruta, the so-called father of Indian surgery, even has a description for a fairly crude but nonetheless effective kind of operation, various eye operations, in particular cataract. So they were, in Sushruta, it is described how you can push the eye lens inside the eye out of the way so that the cataract affected eye lens will no longer obstruct vision. So of course it's far from perfect, but nevertheless the concept existed and must have been practiced to some extent. So Chinese texts also refer to Indian ophthalmological practices. Now, finally, for today we come to the Arab and Persian world, so we're moving towards now the medieval period, which is why my use of the word ancient is a bit elastic, as I said. And here there would be a lot to say, but I have just selected a few examples of how we learn a lot about Indian science and technology from Arabic and Persian texts. Much of it is thanks to an institution which was called the House of Wisdom in Baghdad in the 9th century. It was in Arabic, it was Beit al-Hikmah. My pronunciation is certainly wrong. And this was created by the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, and later on promoted by his son al-Mamun. So these were two very enlightened caliphs who, this was the beginning of Islam, and it has sometimes been known as the golden age of Islam. At that period of time, they were very keen to collect a lot of the ancient knowledge, pre-Islamic knowledge, from especially the Greek world, the Egyptian world, and the Indian world. So these were some of the main sources they were trying to tap, and they were having right there scholars, and we do know from their texts that there were several Indian scholars engaged then there in translating Indian texts, especially of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, into Arabic or Persian. And there is even a saying somewhere that the translators were paid the weight of the manuscript, because books as we know them, printed books, did not exist. The weight of the manuscript translated, that weight in gold was the fee for the translator. If so, it was of course very generous. So you have here a depiction on the right, a painting, an old Persian painting of this house of wisdom, and you see those scholars belonging to various cultures debating together. So this was, of course, a great institution, and in fact, a lot of even Greek texts were recreated because, thanks to these translations, some of the Greek texts were lost, but the translations survived. And something similar happened sometimes with Indian texts. So this is one main channel through which the Indian influence on the Arab world, cultural influence, especially in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, metallurgy, and a few more fields, was channeled. And channeled not only to the Arab world, but beyond, because the Arabs were themselves a channel of transmission to Europe. This is how, for example, the famous decimal numeral notation, you know, the Indian numeral notation with 10 digits, including the 0, this is how it was transmitted to Europe, through the Arabs, not directly. So here we have, for example, from Basra, a contemporary with the House of Wisdom, a scholar who tells us about advanced Indian Jyotisha. So Jyotisha here means astronomy. It does not mean astrology. And Hisab. Hisab is mathematics. And medical sciences, having such secret knowledge that they can cure serious, incurable diseases. Indians are excellent in carving stone statues, in making colored paintings on the niches of the buildings. They are inventors of shatrang, which is Arabic, rendering for chaturanga. Some of you might have heard of chaturanga, the ancestor of chess, which is one of the best intellectual games. The swords are extremely fine. This is a reference to wood steel, exactly what I was explaining a little earlier. One more confirmation, if at all it was necessary. They're fond of swordsmanship and masters of this art. They can neutralize the effect of poison by their mantras. Their music is attractive, and there are many types of Indian dances which are very popular. So in a nutshell, he gives you a kind of very brief portrayal of Indian culture as they saw it from outside, including several important technologies. There are more testimonies. I think I will let you read those testimonies later. Again, the same 9th century AD. Unfortunately, afterwards, it will be a different story when the Muslim invasions of India will begin in the 11th century. Then this whole kind of very appreciative, praiseful language will gradually disappear. Yes? Previous slide. A little louder, please. Oh, yeah. I thought that would attract your curiosity. There are traditions of neutralizing, but this is, you see, mostly in the tantric tradition, of using mantras to neutralize poisons, for example, snake poison. And whether these are effective or not, I'm not going to commit any opinion because I don't have any first-hand experience of it. But healing of snake bite is an established tradition in India. It is both a folk tradition and one day, time permitting, I'll show you a little video taken a few years ago in Kerala where you see in a village how someone who has been bitten by a highly poisonous snake is cured. It's extremely peculiar. And there are some incantations attached to that, but it's mostly also with medicinal plants. And, but it's done in such an unusual way, which I'll not describe it today because it's not exactly relevant. So it's also referred to, healing of snake poisoning is also referred to in some Ayurvedic texts. But as I said, the use of mantras for this purpose is mostly part of the tantric tradition, which also has an overlap or intersection with the Ayurvedic tradition. So this is probably what he refers to here because I don't think he elaborates. So this is what we may assume. So I will let you read those two other quotations of other Muslim scholars of the 9th century about medicine in particular, where we have a lot of appreciation for Indian accomplishments. And another summary is by Said al-Andalusi, who was a very eminent Spanish geographer and historian in the 11th century, who compiled a whole book on, basically on all the nations of the known world, of the then known world. And you see he speaks about the Indians, the Persians, the Chaldeans. Chaldeans means from the region of Iraq, what was earlier Mesopotamia, the Hebrews, the Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, and the Arabs. But among all of them, the first nation is that of the Indians. The Indians, through the centuries and since antiquity, were the source of wisdom, justice, and moderation. They were people endowed with virtues of self-control, creators of sublime thoughts, and universal fables. Remember, for example, Panchatantra, which migrated in all this region, Jataka tales, and so on. Rare inventions and remarkable conceptions. So this is another appreciation by a Muslim scholar of the 11th century. So with this brief survey of, let us say, the ancient world, I close for today. Tomorrow we continue this exact travel, but now we come to mostly European testimonies. And there we will have much more detailed description of the technologies. Because of course we are in the age of technology. The Europeans who will be traveling are themselves familiar with a lot of technologies, but they come to India and they see things being done differently. So that's for tomorrow. Thank you very much.